This video, we will talk about why I. That's kind of a funny name, but when I say I in an algebra course, I'm typically referring to an imaginary number. And that seems strange at first. What do we mean by imaginary? It's all based in our knowledge of square roots. Square roots is something that you may have been introduced a while back. And so let's look at a couple examples and a brief definition. So for example, the square root of 25, you probably know is 5 because 5 squared is 25. And in other words, 5 times 5 or 5 times itself is 25. And we can do a whole bunch of these, like the square root of 144 is commonly known as 12 because 12 squared equals 144. Now, it gets its name because if you were looking at a square with these side lengths, let me do the first one. It's a little easier, like the 5 squared. If you look at a square that has 5 by 5 on each side, it has an area, or inside the number of squares would be 25. And so when you're asking this question, square root 25, it's kind of analogous to you have this square, right, where all the sides are the same length, and the inside is 25. It has an area of 25, and you're asking for what is the outside length of one edge. The outside length would be 5. Now, imaginary number comes in when we do something like, what is the square root of negative 25? Well, this seems a little bit preposterous. First of all, how do we have an area, right? How do we have an inside area of a negative 25? And it simply does not work because you can't have a side length that will make it work. If you use 5 times 5 is positive 25. And if you use negative 5, it's also true that, let me write these down, 5 times 5 is 25, but it's also true that negative 5 times itself is positive 25. So either way, you do not get a negative 25. The only way to get that with real numbers is 5 times negative 5, or in other words, a positive times a negative. So this introduction of I becomes necessary when we think about something having a negative square root value. So the definition of I simply itself is the square root of negative 1. Now, we say that that has no real value. In fact, you can type it into your common calculator. It will often give you an error message or a domain error message. In other words, there is no real number that works. And so when we come across a negative square root, such as negative 25, what we'll do is we'll think of it as the real number, square root 25, times the imaginary square root negative 1. And so we evaluate this part of it. The square root of 25 is 5. And then we'll just rewrite the square root of negative 1 as I. So we will, in a sense, say that square root of negative 25 is I. Let me show you just a couple more practice problems. For example, the square root of negative 81, we will write that as 9I. The square root of negative 144, to go back to that, would be 12I, and so on. If we have something that doesn't have a nice square root, like 35, if we were to take the square root of negative 35, we would just write it as, well, the square root of 35, I. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea of why I hope this makes some